This is a lecture that was originally scheduled a couple of weeks ago. Our guest this evening is Professor Franz Schuurman from the University of California, Berkeley, who will speak to us on the subject China Inside the Dilemma. Professor Schuurman was educated at Harvard, took his degree in Far Eastern languages and history. He has studied in Turkey, Afghanistan, and Japan, has worked in the field of Central Asian history, as well as in the field of Chinese history and contemporary Chinese studies. He has just completed work on a book entitled Ideology and Organization in Communist China, and is just about through with a book on industrial management in Communist China. And besides being employed in two departments at Berkeley, the History Department and the Sociology Department, he has just recently taken over the reins of the new Center for Chinese Studies at Berkeley. He is one of the few scholars in this country who is qualified and competent to discuss the internal organization of Communist China today. It's therefore a great pleasure and a privilege to introduce Professor Franz Schuurman to discuss China Inside the Dilemma.
Before I start, it just dawned on me that people, you know, when I very often give talks on the subject of what's going on inside of China, the first question that arises is, how can you know what's going on? You haven't been there, and you can't travel there, you can't look. And it's a very valid question, and a question I think that I've tried to answer many times. I must say the question is particularly acute now because Mr. Felix Green has just come back from his third visit to Communist China, which makes all of us very envious, who haven't even had a chance to go there for a first visit. But I would like to say, just to begin, that, as you can probably imagine, that the subject of Communist China is an extremely hot subject, if I may use that term. The amount of research in this country that goes on in Communist China is almost beyond belief. Even if you leave aside what goes on in the government and all the various agencies, but simply in universities and elsewhere, it's really quite extraordinary. Nevertheless, it still is true that if you're working in a particular field, there are always not enough people who are working. But still, in simply quantitative terms, the amount of work that goes on is extraordinary. Simply translations, for example. We have mounds and mounds of translations, not to mention the even greater mounds of Chinese material that come in. But you might say, well, what is this after all? It's just propaganda. It's just material that they publish. How can you tell what really is going on? Well, I wish I had time to go into this whole question of how one can learn about a communist country. But let me just speak as someone who has been in the field for quite some time, and I think speak in a way which would echo the opinions of many of my colleagues, that these countries are far more transparent, Communist China and the Soviet Union, than one would imagine. I remember some of the words of friends of mine, and in a sense it was my own experience too, when they went to the Soviet Union, when I went, and their feeling was they did not see much that surprised them there. They began to smell and see things, that is to say, there were sort of intuitive impressions that they had that they couldn't get by reading the documents. But in simply terms of learning things, of seeing something new, they weren't terribly surprised by going to the Soviet Union. And I have a vague feeling this would be true also if I had a chance to go to China. I may be wrong, but what I'm simply saying here is that one can learn an extraordinary amount by documentation. But this is not our only source. There is a place called Hong Kong with thousands, actually millions of refugees that have been coming in, refugees who are extraordinarily articulate, who come from most parts of China, and who, by the way, are not all blind anti-communists. That's to say, anti-communists in the sense that they distort everything what they see, so they don't give you an objective picture. Most of them are confused human beings, anti-communists, but yet ambivalent on the subject, and if you talk to them long enough, you can get an extraordinarily good picture of what's going on in many areas. As a matter of fact, my own feeling would be, even if we had a chance to go to China, the best way of working at it, China, would be to go to someplace in mainland China, like Shanghai or Peking or Lanzhou, and then go back to Hong Kong and talk to the refugees in Hong Kong. Why? Because even under optimal conditions in communist China, it hardly would be possible to talk freely there. No one in the Soviet Union, with very few exceptions, has been able, well, that's not quite true. In recent years, people have, on a private basis, been able to speak freely, but it's still not possible in the Soviet Union to go into a factory, for example, and say, well, how do you do this and how do you do that? You can ask technical questions, but you certainly can't ask a factory director on how he treats his workers, or what his relation with the party secretary are. You can't do that in the Soviet Union. It's hardly likely to be able to do it in communist China. But you can do it in Hong Kong, and if you know enough about interviewing techniques and so on, you can find out a great deal. So all I wanted to say, in these few introductory remarks, is that though it would seem that this is a country that's as far away as the moon, that you can only study through bits of telescopic information, it really isn't so. It's much more transparent than you would think. There's an immense amount of material published in China itself, and there's many refugees who've come out. As I say, if you know how to use all of this information properly, you can get a fairly good picture. Now, I wanted to start off with tonight, which in a sense is the theme, has been the theme of crisis and the overcoming of crisis. We've read a great deal, not so much in the last year or so, but in 1960 and 61, of the terrible conditions in China. Those of us who were in the Far East at the time had some inkling of the depths of the crisis. Information has since come out and shown how deep the crisis actually was. Crisis, I think, has passed, and it's on various parameters of the situation I'd like to talk tonight. But in order to understand what was actually involved in the crisis, in an economic and social, and to some extent political crisis, let me go over very briefly some of the major aspects, major periods, stages of development prior, let's say, in the early 1950s, since 1949, when the Chinese communists seized power. Now, there is a periodization, which I would say is pretty much accepted by all, by the Chinese communists and by ourselves. First of all, the initial period that the Chinese communists have called the transition phase, which lasted from 1949 to 1952. It's an extremely interesting period, again, one that's not been adequately studied, but still about which we know a certain amount. It's a transition phase in the sense that the Chinese communists took power in 1949, and it took them a number of years to consolidate that power. It took them a number of years before they could actually begin a program of rapid social and economic, let's see about the social development, a period of rapid economic development. It also took them a certain amount of time until they could actually consolidate their political power. You can seize power, you can take over a capital city, and it still doesn't mean you have a bureaucracy, you have an administrative system. You have the means of actually enforcing the command that you'd like to issue. Not to mention the fact, of course, that the years 1950, 51, 52, 53 were years of the Korean War, in which the Communist Chinese faced a challenge that they did not expect to face in 1949. But in effect, they had to deal with the continuation of the war that they thought had ended in 1949, but in 1950 began once again. Now, during this period, I would say that the Korean War served a very positive function. It served a positive function in the sense that it provided the kind of external crisis that enabled the Chinese communists to move very fast along the road to political centralization and consolidation. Now, it's a curious thing that war, in organizational terms, can have both a disruptive and a consolidating effect on a nation. For example, if you take the Sino-Japanese War, during the Sino-Japanese War, the communists made excellent use of the crisis atmosphere that was induced in order to organize themselves. At the end of the war, they came out stronger than ever before. The Chinese nationalists, on the other hand, did very little. They took very little advantage of the crisis atmosphere. The result was in 1945, when the war was over, nationalist armies were very undisciplined and were not equipped, actually, to face the problems that they did, namely the challenge from the communists. I may point out that crisis has had this effect also on Russia. From 1928 onwards, during the period of Russian industrialization, Stalin kept on constantly invoking the theme of the fatherland in danger and used this as a means of whipping the Russian population together. And I may say simply, or for example, for that matter, Japan in 1870 to 1880, during the initial period of Japanese industrialization, the theme that constantly went through this period was one of national crisis. If we don't industrialize fast, the Western nations, America, Britain, France, Russia, will overwhelm us. So that the whole sense of national crisis can have a very positive effect. It can give a shot in the arm to a nation to mobilize energies that it wouldn't under normal conditions. So in this sense, the Korean War probably in an ultimate sense was beneficial in terms of political consolidation as far as the Chinese, as far as the internal situation in communist China was concerned. Now, in 1953, the Chinese communists began their first five-year plan. The first five-year plan lasted until 57. Now, among economists and political scientists and sociologists and so on working on the subject, there's an immense amount of discussion as to what planning is and what a planned system is and so on. And I may say I've just finished a long monograph on industrial management in China, the effect of which is to say that there isn't much in the way of planning and never has been in communist China. But still, they mark their periods of development in terms of plans. In any case, during this first five-year plan period, which began in 1953, and was really pushed very seriously in 1954, which was a year in which they finally completed the process of political centralization. In 1954, they were able to proclaim the formal establishment of the Chinese People's Republic. And this occurred simultaneously with the elimination of a very serious dissident element in Manchuria, a man by the name of Gao Gang, who probably was a Russian agent involved in Beria's network of secret police and whatnot, and whose position was made somewhat untenable after Stalin's death and the destruction of the secret police in Russia. In any case, with the consummation of political centralization in 1954, the five-year plan went into high gear. Now, what did the Chinese want to do during their first five-year plan? They had the instruments now. Concentrated political power, they had a well-functioning bureaucracy, they had a certain amount of technical talent, and of course they had massive Soviet aid. They wanted to build a modern heavy industry, an advanced modern sector, more or less emulating what the Russians had done. The Russian pattern of industrialization had been one of emphasizing the building of heavy industries and more or less leaving light industry and consumer goods industry by the wayside, and using agriculture largely for purposes of exploitation. You get your savings from agriculture and put them into heavy industry. Now the Chinese pushed, in effect the Chinese really emulated the Russians in a very, very detailed way. Russian language was learned with great intensity. I knew one man who in 1 year learned extraordinarily good Russian. He was a Chinese from Indonesia. And he studied Russian 13 hours a day, and for 1 year he was forbidden to speak a word of Chinese. For 1 year he spoke nothing but Russian, and his Russian was absolutely excellent. So these were quite good language teaching methods, as far as I could control, as far as I could judge. But in any case, Russian translations of Russian works began to appear. Everything was Su Lian Ge Ge, our elder brother, the Soviet Union. much big thing during this period. And of course, not to mention direct Soviet aid, or rather aid not so much in the form of grants, but in the form of loans and whatnot. The Russians sent whole industrial plants to China. There's some confusion as a number, but whole machinery plants, steel plants, etc., staffed with the latest equipment. At that time, people said that some of the equipment was of even more modern manufacture than stuff one was seeing in the Soviet Union. So that whatever Stalin's purposes in aiding China, and they certainly were not entirely philanthropic, there were certain nefarious ulterior motives, still, nevertheless, he sent the best stuff to China. There can be little doubt about that. The Chinese were probably very lucky to get it. They did not push second or third rate material onto the Chinese. In other words, this was a period of basic industrialization through setting up a modern heavy industrial base. Now, the Chinese, even during their second five-year plan period, which began in 1958 and should have actually run until the end of 1962, but in effect ended in 1961, beginning of 1961, and which the Chinese called the Great Leap Forward, they still held to this idea that you must build a great heavy industrial base. But nevertheless, they developed a new idea, a new form of economic strategy at the time. And I think it's rather important to note this if you want to understand the background of the crisis. That one of the consequences of development along Russian lines was that you were creating rather wide gaps. You were creating a modern sector, big cities like Shanghai and Mukden and Lanzhou and so on, with all of the accoutrements of modern industry. At the same time, the rest of the country would remain backward, and that this gap would increase. Now, gaps of this sort are well known in many parts of the world. In Italy, for example, the whole, what they call the problem of the Mezzogiorno, southern Italy remaining backward or not progressing as fast as the north and so on. And even in our own United States has been a problem, not so much now, but in the past, the south and the north and so on. And this always poses large problems in terms of overall economic development. The Chinese communists were disturbed by this fact. And in 1958, under the slogan, the Great Leap Forward, they started a campaign, what they called simultaneous development throughout the whole country. In other words, they would carry the Industrial Revolution even to the most remote provinces of China. Every small area was to have its bit of modern industry. Now, they carried this to absurd points. The backyard steel campaign was perhaps the most absurd manifestation of this, and certainly was part of the absurdity and the excessive investment in useless and irrational capital construction projects that was one of the bases of the crisis that later erupted. And that was, the idea was a rather extraordinary one, and I think and one certainly to be considered. Namely that if you're going to get a whole society moving, you can't just let the modern sector move ahead and then let the rest of the country, which meant 80 to 85% of the country, catch up whenever it can. But let's prod the whole country into action. Now the prodding turned out to be too severe. Communes and party mobilization and militarization of the whole economy, and was a major factor leading to crisis, drop in morale, and so on. But nevertheless, the idea was there. The idea was you've got to prod the whole country into development. If I may express a personal opinion, probably in the future, if the Chinese do continue to move ahead, and the signs are now that they will probably become a great power, will industrialize one way or another, we don't know exactly in what fashion, then they may have accomplished something through the Great Leap Forward that the effects of which we can't evaluate yet at the present time. That is to say, they may have prodded the country into some sort of movement. And this is something that, now, I don't know much about India, but what little I know, I think the Indians have not yet succeeded in doing for a variety of reasons. That there are certainly very advanced areas in India, but there are other large areas that somehow have been untouched by the Industrial Revolution and by modernization and so on. In any case, we don't know. Still, the Chinese communists tried it, and they tried it with absolutely concentrated totalitarian methods. I mean, the sort of methods that are almost unbelievable. Working people 16 hours a day and sending party cadres around. More or less the anthill type of approach that Robert Guillain, the French writer, described in this book, The Blue Ants. A really terrible kind of mass mobilization, not done so much with physical cruelty. As a matter of fact, the Chinese communists, except for the original revolutionary terror, when they killed a lot of people, millions were killed in China during the late 40s, the early 1950s. But after that, they've gone in more for psychological coercion. So there wasn't so much bloodshed, or the kind of physical coercion you associate with the Soviet labor camps, but more psychological coercion and prodding and pushing and so on, persuasion, which is a favorite Chinese communist term. All right, in any case, you had, here was the great leap forward, and this whole emphasis on fast. As a matter of fact, the slogan at that time was "Dokai Haosan," fast, quick, good, and economize. But they didn't do much in the way of good, and they didn't do much in the way of economizing, but it was fast and quick. This was the big slogan. You got to move fast. 3 years of suffering and 1,000 years of happiness was the slogan. It turned out to be 3 years of suffering ending in crisis. There wasn't any 1,000 years of happiness. They were quite right in 3 years. The Great Leap Forward lasted exactly 3 years. In any case, let's get to the question of crisis. Now, I want to say here that I think this, in discussing the whole question of crisis, one must never overlook the fact that by the time the Chinese communists had got to the crisis point, let's say 1960 and 1961, that they already moved a long way. Communist China, the way it appeared in 1961, was very, very different from what it was in 1949. You can't use terms like progress or anything of that sort. It's hard to use those terms. But you can use the terms of change, development, transformation, and so on. A lot had occurred. There'll be historians maybe 10 or 20 years from now that can evaluate it fully. But nevertheless, a lot had occurred. But the Dokai, the much and fast, had exacted a price. And in 1960-61, a really terrible crisis erupted. My wife and I were in Hong Kong at the time, and you could begin to feel this from the refugees who were coming in. As I say, if you've had dealings with refugees for a while, you can tell whether they're exaggerating or not. At that time, there was no doubt, there was no exaggeration, that they were telling the absolute truth. Things were very bad. First of all, the crop failures, terrible crop failures. And there were two causes, and it's hard to say which was more important, but both were there. There were natural disasters, drought, floods, the usual kind of disasters that have been afflicting China for centuries, for millennia. And of course, the fact that the commune system had really utterly disoriented the peasantry. That collectivization has worked in no communist country. It's the most incredible thing. Here are these communists who, 40 years or 50 years ago when the Russian Revolution first broke out, apparently the common attitude was, well, these primitive Russian mujiks, they know agriculture, but they'll never be able to make a machine. And the same thing was said about the Chinese. After all, the Chinese are experts at agriculture, but they can never make a machine. It turns out the communists are perfectly able to make machines, but they can't make agriculture work. No communist country, except possibly for the Yugoslavs and the Poles, who have decollectivized, have ever been able to do anything with agriculture. And this is what old Nikita Sergeyevich now is so worried about, and not to mention the Chinese communists. Mao Zedong, by the way, agriculture is Mao Zedong's main concern. He's always written constantly about agriculture. So the first thing, the first element, the very terrible food shortage. Secondly, the industrial expansion was so rapid that overinvestment, overproduction, clogging of communication facilities, that literally industry came to a standstill. There were material shortages, electric power shortages. After all, an industrial system is still a system. It's a little bit like a human body, I suppose. There has to be kind of smooth flows. Occasionally you can have jerks, but there have to be certain smooth flows in an industrial system. But when everything is out of kilter, as it was in China at this period, nothing meshed together. That an industrial process is still a complex process, and unless you get your raw materials in time and enough electricity, it won't work. So that there was, after these 3 years of fantastic overproduction, everything just ground to a halt, including, in some instances, strategic industries, even though the government did everything it could to keep them going. Then there was the breakdown, or rather the stoppage of aid from the Soviet Union, which came at the worst period. This is something Mao, I think, hasn't forgiven Khrushchev for. The Chinese very often feel like in a family you can quarrel, but if it comes down to brass tacks, you will help each other. The Chinese family system is a very, it's not a peaceful one at all. There's constant quarreling going on, but when it comes down to the facts, the question of existence, and they all band together. So Mao certainly assumed that despite the rift, the Soviet Union, Khrushchev should continue to send capital goods to China, but he didn't. He cut down on his exports to China, which made Mao very angry. Now, there were probably real reasons in the Soviet Union why he did so, overcommitment of resources and so on. But nevertheless, at the time in which the Chinese were really in their worst plight, in 1960 and 61, suddenly the flow of goods from the Soviet Union declines sharply. Then there was the very terrible and sharp decline in morale. It's not just that people didn't have enough to eat, but the pressuring from the party cadres was so intense. After all, people telling you do this, do that, and do everything else. So little in the way of any kind of freedom or any kind of autonomy for the individual, that people simply became listless and passive. Now, certain people can still operate fairly well if they're listless and passive. But what happens if you get technicians who are responsible for complicated production operations? I interviewed some people who worked in a great oil refinery in Lanzhou, and they said that the technicians were so listless and apathetic that they just didn't control the valves any longer. And the party secretaries would come in and say, well, control those valves better. But they just didn't feel like it. And no amount of persuasion and criticism and self-criticism and whatnot helped. That there just was a lowering of morale. And finally the communists, they got this through their heads, that you can't force people with technical skills to produce optimally. You have to create the correct conditions. Now, despite the fact that, and I might mention this is an extremely important fact, there was no major uprising in China during this period. There were some riots. We have information on some of them, none of which were very extensive. Most of which were exaggerated by the nationalists into uprisings of major proportions. But as far as I know, that there was little more than minor uprisings. There was a big riot in Canton, but many of these were riots and not revolts. As a matter of fact, I would say most of those that I've heard about were riots for a variety of reasons. Nevertheless, there was a lot of dissatisfaction and protest, and recently the State Department made available some important documents, regimental bulletins, which were obtained from mainland China in certain ways, which give us a very graphic picture of what conditions were like in rural areas. Very bad, a lot of protest, soldiers' morale had really sunk low, and as I say, isolated outbursts and riots and so on. Anyway, a situation that no communist regime could accept with equanimity. Something had to be done. Now, it was at this time that in the West, and to some extent in the Far East too, that something arose which can be called the Collapse Thesis. In this country, I think it was spread mostly by Joe Alsop, and his articles circulated very widely and were actually fairly influential. And in the Far East, of course, it was largely the Chinese nationalists who began to spread this idea that the collapse was imminent. In any case, there was, let's say, there were certainly grounds for believing it at the time. After all, China was in a very bad way, and who knows, nations have collapsed for lesser reasons than that. But I just bring up this collapse thesis here because the Chinese communists themselves have made reference to it at a later date. Now, the Chinese communists, in light of this crisis, made a sudden about-face in January 1961, and they, I would say, turned their backs on the whole previous way of doing things, and turned to perhaps the only means that they could have turned to under those conditions. Namely, they introduced what in an article of mine that's being published now, I called something that's comparable to what the Russians did in the early 1920s, introduced a NEP, a new economic policy. That is to say, with far-reaching concessions to individual autonomy, even in some kind of covered way to quasi-private enterprise. I don't throw this out too seriously. But they reintroduced conditions that are remarkably capitalistic, remarkably reminiscent of market-type relationships, and remarkably similar to what you find in Yugoslavia. As a matter of fact, the Chinese economy today, and has been developing since the lowest point of the crisis in winter of 1960-61, is a far cry from even the kind of system you have in the Soviet Union. It's a far cry from the kind of system the Chinese communists tried to introduce. I'm now talking about the economy. I'm not talking about other elements of the system. There's a lot of private trading. There are a lot of free markets. There's a lot of price formation that's not set by the state. There's a lot of free exchange. There's even been the remnant capitalist class that you still have left in China. There are even a couple of communist millionaires around. They've even received a renewed license to continue to exist for a while. As I say, all this is very strange when you contrast it with the militant ideology, the real ultra-left-wing kind of ideology. But this shouldn't be so surprising for anyone who knows Soviet history, because the Russians did this in the early 1920s. In the early 1920s, you had a retreat to capitalism, which Lenin called 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. You went back to capitalism, but yet the whole Bolshevik militancy remained at the same time. That there was no lessening on the ideological front. The Bolsheviks were no less militant in the NEP period, the New Economic Policy period, from 1921 to 1928 than they were either earlier or later. But nevertheless, in terms of operating the economy, they really went back to capitalism. And I would say, except for admitting private enterprise, which the Chinese communists haven't done, and which actually can't do under the present time, they've pretty much gone back to the same thing. I could go into more details, but I think for reasons of time considerations, I won't. They've also, by the way, done other things which are extremely interesting. They've moved to a program of large-scale investment in agriculture, and they've really been building up their consumer goods industry. And this has paid off. Conditions are much better in China now than in 1963 and 1964. All reports indicate that standard of living is going up slowly for the peasants. I mean, life is still pretty tough in China, but compared to what it was during the crisis period, things are a lot better. And one barometer that you always have for measuring economic conditions in China are the rate of outpouring of refugees, which, by the way, one must remember, Hong Kong and Macau are very different from Berlin. This is a bamboo curtain. There are a lot of holes, and sometimes even the gates go right up. It's a very curious thing that most people don't know. That if you go to the border in Hong Kong, the barbed wire is on the British side, not on the Chinese side. If anybody's interested, I'm willing to talk about it later on. The Chinese communists have, not exactly openly, but sometimes, as a matter of fact, during the Great Exodus, they openly let them out. May 1962, the Chinese Communist border guards even showed them the way to Hong Kong. Hong Kong is over there. So that, in effect, this is not like the Berlin Wall, where the guards shoot if anyone tries to get across. Now, as I said, there's a barometer for measuring economic conditions, and that's the rate of outflow of refugees. And in the last year or so, they've been reduced to a trickle. So, I mean, this is the way it was in the past. The past, let's say, 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, if things were bad in China, they went to Hong Kong. When things got better on the Guangdong side, they went back again. In any case, and this investment in agriculture, building up the consumer goods industry, was accompanied by a drastic cutback in investment in heavy industry. That's to say, in precisely the great pride of any communist country, the big, large-scale factories. But they finally realized that if something had to go, and they were willing to sacrifice heavy industry, and this is quite something for a communist regime, to really cut back that drastically on investment in heavy industry. Now the heavy industry, investment in heavy industry has picked up again lately, but they cut back very, very sharply. The big steel plants just about shut down during the periods of crisis, and not just because of lack of materials. If they wanted to keep them going, by force and coercion, they could have brought in the ore, they could have brought in the coal, and so on, but they cut back investment and production very sharply. Now, things have been looking up. The crop in 1962 was not bad. It was the best since 1957. In 63 it was even better. What it's going to be like in 1964 we don't know, but the chances are it will be good because crops seem to come to cycles. And also because the Chinese communists have adopted an incentive policy for the peasants. Work more, earn more, is the slogan. And they've not only adopted the incentive policy, but through a variety of mechanisms, they try to make sure that the peasants, that they can soak up increased peasant purchasing power by making sure they can buy industrial goods. So farmers can buy a bicycle or a kerosene lamp or textiles, clothes, by medium of what they call sort of supply sales cooperatives. So they're trying to resolve a problem that was one of the reasons that the Russians in 1928 resorted to collectivization. Because in 1928 the Russian peasants had too much in the way of purchasing power, but nothing to buy. So that since they had nothing to buy, they wouldn't sell their food to the cities, so that you faced a terrible food problem in the cities. Now the Chinese communists, by very widespread use of these supply sales cooperatives, have been trying to make sure that peasants can buy goods with their money, and this way the money comes back into the into the urban sector again. We can't tell how successful this has been. I mean, there are no macroeconomic or macro social statistics in this sort of thing, but from what refugees from different parts report, that it has not been unsuccessful. Now, what of the crisis? Now, to say a few more words of the crisis, that there were in effect two crises. One was an economic crisis that I've already talked about. Another one was a political organizational crisis, which I think broke out or became acute a bit later, perhaps late 61, 62. One of the main problems in the economic crisis was that during the years of the Great Leap Forward, the party ran the economy. That instead of having a factory manager make decisions as to what should be produced, the party secretary did. And the party secretaries were very often workers and peasants. And they would say, well, we'll do it this way or that way. We don't need industrial designs. We don't need accounting. We don't need money. All we need is production. So in effect, part of the mess was created by party direction of the economy. So in 1960-61, or in January 1961, when they made the radical shift in the economy, this had to mean only one thing. You pull the party out of the economy. In other words, you and you change the function of the party in the system. This meant taking people who are accustomed to be leaders and to dominate and reducing their position. In effect, had to be done by a small-scale purge. Now, the purge was carried out very carefully, with a great deal of circumspection, because if you carried it out in a large-scale way, it could have wrecked the whole system. Because Communist China is really run by the party. It's an extraordinary instrument, far more supple and successful and a much better instrument for control than the Soviet Party ever was. So that when you start something against the parties, it's a very dangerous thing. And but the regime felt it had to do it because it was the party's involvement in the economy that really was at the root of all the trouble, for the major part. Now, this meant that sooner or later they would face the problem of a decline in the morale of the party groups. And this did happen. And toward the end of 1961, as all the professionals were coming back again and the professionals were having a good time, they were all feeling that the regime needed them again. But the party people were losing morale, and since the party was very tightly involved with the army, this meant in effect that the military also were facing a morale problem. So this brought about a political crisis, and a political crisis in the sense of a crisis within the instrument that controlled the country. I'm not talking about Mao Zedong, I'm talking about the little local party cells and the party groups and organizations that are spread all over the local areas of China. There was a real lowering of morale on the part of these people. Now, it was in the spring of 1962 that the nationalists made noises about invasion. And I think is that they smelled somehow that there was a political crisis, there was a system crisis. At that time, the Chinese ambassador in Warsaw, Wang Bingnan, who's been talking with our man there for a long time, called us a hurried meeting and asked us whether we would support Chiang Kai-shek in an invasion of the mainland. And as far as I gather, we told them we wouldn't. But in any case, they got through this political crisis too. I won't go into details now on how this was done in a variety of ways. But they pulled the party together again, and they pulled the army together again. So that by the fall of 1962, when they convened their 10th plenum, September 1962, they had surmounted that crisis. They surmounted the economic crisis. They started moving upward, I would say, late 61, 62. And by late 62, they surmounted the political crisis too. Now, and all of this without the benefit of much aid from elder brother, the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, all of this in the face of a real breakdown in relations with the Soviet Union. Now, we're reaching the 50 minutes time, and let me conclude and make a few concluding remarks. Where does China go from here? Well, I suppose all of us would like to know. My feeling is that if things remain as they are, in terms of the way the system works institutionally, and they may not, one never knows what can happen in a communist country, but that by virtue of having surmounted this crisis, without really, without corpses being piled up on the street, and without a serious breakdown in the system, I mean, they really, my own feeling is that considering the magnitude of the crisis that they faced, they got through it in a rather remarkable way. If things remain equal, they're in for a period of slow but steady economic growth, especially if they keep to these quasi-capitalistic methods they've reintroduced, which they'll never, of course, admit in practice. Or rather, they admit them, but you have to sort of, read their jargon, which is perfectly transparent once you learn it. In other words, things being what they are, they could now enter a period of slow but steady economic growth. This, I think, is remarkably significant because they've done this on their own. And they always point out, they say, well, in contrast to India, which is in a period of some difficulty, India is in a period of difficulty despite the fact that it's had a vast amount of American, British, and other foreign aid. Chinese communists make great fun of India. They always say that we've been able to do all of this on our own. They even have a slogan over and over again, Sili Gang Seng. We rebirth through our own efforts. They pride themselves on this. We've gone it ourselves. Nobody's helped us. Even our great friend, the Soviet Union, has left us in the lurch. But things, and by the way, I may add another point here, which has some, I think, on the diplomatic and foreign affairs front is very important. That the Chinese communists, I think, now really see themselves as an independent, autonomous power that has to be taken in those terms, no longer just as a member of the socialist bloc, as they call it. That even in earlier conferences, the Chinese communists still tended to follow Soviet leadership, but I think now they're saying, we are now an independent power that has to be reckoned with. We're not just a partner or an ally or a mouthpiece for the Soviet Union. And this has a lot to do with the French recognition that, and Zhou Enlai's trip to Africa, I think, is all bound up with this message that they're saying. And it's only been a recent message. They're saying we're now as much of an independent power as America, Britain, Russia, any of the other great powers. Now I asked the question, where does China go from here? I would say, unless my reading of the internal situation is wrong, it might very well be, there are really two areas which one should watch, and only one of which is within China. And one that's a very crucial area is the area of leadership, succession. There's a system of industrial management in both Russia and China. It used to be in China. It was called one-man management. Well, totalitarian countries are one-man type countries. There's no getting around it that figures like Stalin, Khrushchev, Mao Zedong are important, and it's rather important if they leave the scene. And I think there's a lot of indication that Mao Zedong has kept together a structure in which there's a certain amount of dialogue, if I may use a rather neutral term, maybe even conflict, we don't know. But certainly there are people way in the top of the Chinese leadership who think differently, who have different views. Not that there was any opposition. There may have been people like Peng Dehuai, who may have been kind of opposition. There's supposed the rumors of a pro-Khrushchev opposition. I don't think it's so much that, as rather it's that there are liberals and conservatives. People want to go, the hard and soft types, not all intermediate types. But nevertheless, there's been a lot of dialogue and discussion and exchange at the top levels of the Chinese leadership. And Mao has been a kind of mediator. He's been a kind of man who's held these groups together. There seems some reason for seeing Mao in this light. He has positive ideas too, but he's also had this mediating function. So that I think this is an extremely important question, that the system may be moving along now. And certainly, if you look at the Soviet Union, when Stalin died, the system didn't fall apart. It had been pretty well institutionalized. And I think the same thing is true of China. The system is pretty well grounded and rooted. I think my own feeling is talk of a collapse right now is nonsense. In fact, nobody talks about collapse any longer. But on the other hand, things can happen to China such as happened to the Soviet Union after Stalin's death as a result of a change in leadership. And paradoxically, I might say, it's very strange, both Taiwan and the Soviet and Communist China have leaders that are about the same age. Now the last point to make here is the international situation. I think a lot of what happens internally in China depends on whether the détente continues, that is to say the present world détente, the peaceful situation, or whether things tighten up again, that is to say whether a war type situation breaks out. If the war clouds start gathering again, I can see the Chinese internally beginning to radicalize once again, tightening the reins. On the other hand, if the war clouds don't arise, and who knows where the war clouds can come from, they can come from anywhere. If the war clouds don't arise again and the present situation remains, I can see things within China going on more the way they are now.